Welcome to another episode of Coach's Corner. Today we are joined by Claire from Resilient Training Lab, and of course, always Trevor Jaffe. What's up, guys?
Going on?
Hey, what's up?
Not much, not much. Claire was one that left a review that was randomly picked.
Screwed that up so bad.
So she is on, but the good thing is that she's a coach, a newer coach for Resilient Training Lab, which is Paul Milano's group of coaches and trainers up there in the Connecticut area. So it's always good to have the ability to bring on newer coaches that are coming up that put out good content that may not necessarily get the recognition they deserve, and we give them a small platform, but a platform nonetheless to come on the show. And if you don't screw this up, maybe this will be something that we do on a regular basis where we bring in up and coming coaches and have them on, and either we can expose them as the frauds that they are, or they can become, part of the elite coaching crew that myself and Trevor hold near and dear to our hearts because we're the only members of it.
No pressure. Yeah. The two-man wolf pack.
So, Claire, give everyone just a quick little background about who you are and how you got into coaching and why you decided to become a powerlifting coach or strength coach.
Yeah, sure. So, like everything in 2020, it was a little bit of a tumultuous year for me. I had decided on a career pivot right at the beginning, and I'm super happy about that now. I was a little dicey there in the middle, but I was a graphic designer and a marketer before this for about 3 years, and was feeling a little bit just like unfulfilled in that position. And I kind of picked up powerlifting in the midst of that. So I'd been going to the gym and was feeling a little directionless, and then started following some powerlifters on Instagram and was like, ooh, I like this. Can I do this? So started that. From there, I got my NASM certification, my Precision One certification, and was ready to kind of jump into the fitness industry. And then quarantine happened.
Yeah.
um, which was, at the same time, it was the biggest blessing in disguise. So I went to your coaching seminar back in January, and that is where I met Paul and Ryan. And at the time, I'd met them and, thought they were super cool. And like, I was like, oh, I didn't know we had this in Connecticut. This is awesome. And halfway through quarantine, I had had another job kind of lined up, but I wasn't really sure where I wanted to go. And Paul messaged me and was like, hey, would you want to come work with us? And I'm like, I don't know if I can. I'm not sure about this, but ever since then, they kind of took me under their wing. They've been mentoring me along the way and helping me with my powerlifting career and my coaching career. So that's kind of where I started. I got my certifications, which are like the barrier to entry, and I've been learning ever since. So
That's
yeah.
awesome. What made you have the reservation of like maybe I'm not ready for this when they invited you on?
Just so as new as I was in the industry, I saw what they were doing, and I was like, oh my God, I don't know if I can do that. Because within the NASM framework, they prepare you in as much as they can, but I was always like preparing for like a personal training position. I didn't want to have that coach title just yet, because I was like, I'm brand new at this, I don't know what I'm doing, like kind of that imposter syndrome that comes along with being new in an industry. But they've made me very, very comfortable, and we do education every weekend, like every week. And they actually have the RTL mentorship right now that I'm going through, that's been helping me build my confidence on you know how to cue, when to cue, how to coach people in general, and just kind of give me that foundation to build on. So
Yeah, that's awesome because you have Paul who like hates almost everyone in the industry. So it's like, man, if I'm getting coached by this guy, I better like watch what I say. So I didn't know if the reservation came from that because obviously like when people have strong opinions, it can tend to like overshadow other people's ability to be creative because you don't want to be chastised every time you say something. But obviously, Paul's persona on calling out poor, because it's I don't know, it's not like he calls people out where it's something that's like kind of iffy. He calls people out on really good stuff,
yeah.
and it's like, prove what you say, and most people can't.
I've talked to him about that. He likes to encourage critical thought. He's like me. He's a little bit more aggressive in his attack of it, but he's like me where he discourages dogma.
Yeah.
Because the more we know, the more our opinions change, or we understand application of those things a little bit different. So he likes to call people out who make blanket statements and dogma statements, as true or false or correct when there's a lot of gray area in them. And I always would joke with him, I'm like, my whole goal is not to end up as like the catalyst for one of your memes. Because some of them I'm like, man, that kind of hits home a little bit. They're usually pretty funny, but there's a lot of relevance to them because he understands that if you are coaching, you're coaching an individual. Sometimes we do have programs that are for the masses, like the train along program or pre-sock templates, or we did the coaches corner coaching for a while, or a little bit of programming, and that's general. General sound principles that people can progress from. When you get to a certain level, you might start looking for individualization, and that individualization is what he's talking about. Is not everything's going to apply to everyone, and when people make a generic statement, it can take half the people out of that population who this might apply to, and people start getting offended or triggered or hurt. So he tries to push critical thought, which I think is really, really important.
Mm-hmm. Agreed too. And I think that was when I first started, I shadow them throughout our coaching hours and stuff like that. And that was the biggest thing that when I first started, I had a lot of vocabulary that was very kind of fear mongering or very critical of certain things. You see someone do like a deadlift or something, and you'd see like backgrounding or this and that, and you'd want to jump all over them and start correcting. And they kind of sat me down and be like, all right, we prioritize here. Like, we need to make sure that we're bringing a lot of good quality content, but also not scaring people away. These are not, these people, we're lucky to have them in the gym in the first place. We don't want to scare anyone away from being too critical, or just being all up in their face and confusing them. So that was one of my things. I had to kind of gain new vocabulary very quickly in terms of the way I frame my narratives, and especially around pain. They're huge about pain and injury with, trying not to scare anyone away, or so use scare tactics in order to change something or correct something. So it was really, really nice to have that, but it was definitely a learning curve very quickly of like, this is a much better way to do this. Cool. Okay, awesome.
Yeah, definitely. And that kind of brings us to the question that you had for us as well, is this idea of like sensationalized black and white statements. So go ahead with your question.
Yeah, so my question was for you guys, whenever you frame content, especially on Instagram and places that content can go viral, is there anything that you guys try to do now with your narratives to make sure that it doesn't do that, or to kind of just make sure that your content comes across the way you intend it to?
Go ahead, Trevor.
Yeah, it's a fine line. I do my best to avoid speaking in absolutes. I might use the word optimal or ideally to say that this is going to apply to the broad spectrum of people, but not everyone. There are some people who literally like to stir the pot and create controversy by putting out, they have huge audiences, and they'll put out a statement literally for that debate and argument. Just lets me know they have nothing better to do with their time, because instead of teaching, they're trying to pontificate or start some shit so people will constantly come back and spread their message around and get people talking. And then, their fan club and their fanboys come in. I look at that as hate culture. That's literally what I call it. I call it hate culture, because they're so miserable in their own lives that what they want to do is draw people into that argument with them, so then the people who support them could then hate everybody else who has a different opinion. And in my life, I want people who have a different opinion about something than me, so I can maybe learn something or change my perspective and not be stuck in the same dogma. I know the instance you were talking about, and Tony has talked about it before, making those blanket statements for the controversial fact for them, because it creates attention, but it doesn't create awareness or education. It is a very strong opinion, and when someone puts that very strong opinion out, they're alienating a lot of people and making them feel bad about their choices. In this particular case, the one you would talk to us before the podcast, it was that a lifter shouldn't be in wraps until they are an elite level squatter. And that's probably to some degree true, that if you were trying to be the best possible squatter in wraps, you should bring up your raw squat. That's wrong. But everyone who's doing this, 99% of people are doing this as a hobby. They're going to compete how they want, where they want, with what they want, because that's what they enjoy. So by making people feel bad about competing, they're doing to feel better about themselves, you're kind of an asshole. That's my opinion. I'll be blunt on it.
Yeah, no, I agree. And it's interesting because you kind of almost went down that rabbit hole with your crew, right? Whenever you and Casey had that issue of the we thing, and then you had a bunch of people jumping on Casey's bandwagon, talking shit to Casey, and you quickly made a video about like to not do that. Then you actually had a conversation with Casey just to make sure that people didn't do that, because you want everyone to have their opinion, right? You want people to be able to have their opinion, whether it's wrong or right. It doesn't really matter. Open dialogue, open conversation, creativity and thought, creativity and dialogue is something that we lack in this industry. So to continue to like kind of try to blunt that is just a negative thing in general. And that says a lot about you that you were able to do that. And it says a lot about the people who followed you because they quickly dropped it as well. And the idea of like when you put out content, you have a bunch of different choices you can go the route of. As coaches and educators, myself and Trevor, we try to go the route of how can we help as many people as possible, or how can we help the one specific person that asked us the question. And there's context and nuance to each of those. Somebody may ask Trevor a specific question on, I don't know, what do you do, like the dick and mouth throat thing? I don't know what you do. You do some weird shit and you give it weird cues. I'm not sure. I don't want to go down that rabbit hole. But so that was a specific cue for a specific instance of what somebody needed to do to fix that. And that could have been from one specific person, and you try to make it as broad as possible. But then you can go into the context of like, well, if you're talking about program design, that has to be a very broad concept, because if you make it super specific, that may only be for one person. So it's like, what are you trying to put out there? And in terms of like, who are you trying to educate? Are you trying to be helpful, or are you trying to just stir stuff up, right? To say no one should be in knee sleeves until they have an elite total without having much context to it is just a stupid statement. You're just trying to get people to agree with you, and the shit on the people who, oh, this person has a 200-pound squat in reps. And it's like, they shouldn't be doing that. It's like, well, they can do whatever they want to, right? Like, it's supposed to be a sport that you enjoy and have fun doing, and to chastise people who do it are going to make them feel uncomfortable. And people wonder why in powerlifting there's this one and done environment and crowd, of people doing one meet and then they don't ever compete again. It's because there's a lot of dickheads out there too who make people feel uncomfortable, and they have this elitist status, yet they talk shit about people that have elite status. And it's like, you're just, people that usually do that are just throwing stones in a glass house, and they're just trying to, like Trevor said, cause up some type of stir and controversy because they have nothing else better to do within their day but to have people pat them on the back and say, oh, I'm glad somebody finally said it. It's like, have context to it, right? Like, help people out, tell them why they shouldn't be in reps, tell them what they should do to get to reps, but you have people like that, like the Squat University guy putting out content that's very black and white to try to sell his book. So he's just trying to make things controversial so people tag and post and tag friends. And then it's like in his next post, like, oh, well, I got this book coming out that'll answer all the questions. It's like, that's not what you want to do as someone who's trying to provide education. But that's kind of the mix of business and education perspective out there. But whenever I put out content, I try to give as much nuance as possible. And then I always try to end with a caveat of like, this is just my opinion. There's a million ways to do stuff, understand what the concept is that we're trying to get out there, and then build your own ideology based around what you believe in. And if it makes sense, add it in and see if it helps out. And if it doesn't, then it may not fit what you're trying to do at that specific time. And that's just kind of the way I think of it. If you're trying to just help people, then you can never go wrong. And if you're not trying to do that, then it's like, well, why are you, like, what are you trying to do, right? Yeah.
Sure. And one aspect is coaching. If you're teaching people or helping them expound on something, like Tony said, if you were to say, you can do this to improve your squat to get to this level, that's coaching. Versus you shouldn't do this, that's content creation, it's marketing, it's creating chaos and controversy. So like Tony said, people will tag you and share it and send it around and get conversation going. That's marketing tactics. That is not coaching.
And now, do you guys think that responsibility of being able to sniff out the kind of the BS, do you think that falls to your general audience, or do you think that falls to us, like the fellow coaches, to like call out other stuff as well, or just to maybe combat it with our own positive content?
That's exactly the answer. Yeah. Combat it with your own positive content. I'm not in the call out culture. I try to avoid that. I've been sucked in a couple times, and I always regret it every time I am. I don't want to be involved in that call out culture and hate culture. I just want to create content that is helpful and coach supposed to do.
Yeah, I mean, same. I agree. It's like you're not trying to perpetuate the cycle by calling this person out just to get everyone on board. Like, I talk to a lot of people that I look up to within this industry. Jordan Shallow is a good example of that, and he gets pulled into a lot of stuff, and he never takes the bait, because what's the point, right? Are you really gonna have an intellectual conversation through social media? It's like, no, it's like such a waste of time. It's like the worst possible place to have an intellectual conversation with someone that has different viewpoints. You know, if someone really had an issue with myself or Trevor, they can always jump on the podcast and we could talk it out in a long, you know, contextual way. And you never know, like we may all come to the same conclusion, we may not, but that's just the way that I would prefer to do it. And if it doesn't go that route, then it's just a waste of time. Like we have other shit we do. Our lives are focused more around helping out our clients and trying to put out good content than it is to debunk that stuff. So as an athlete, it's your job to decipher some of that as well, you know, understanding the difference of this person is just putting out black and white statements with no context to it. That's probably not someone I should ever come to for, you know, knowledge, right? So it's always tough to tell the consumer to be more knowledgeable because, you know, they have other shit they got to do too. That's why they go to coaches to figure it out. But it's a 50-50 mix. You know, there should, with no barrier to entry in our industry of like who can say what, it just makes it very, very difficult. But if you're putting out good content, people will end up finding you, and then they'll realize what good content is and what shitty content is, and they'll start to leave the shitty content for sure.
Sweet. Thank you guys.
Yeah.
Rob.
So next question Trevor has.
We had an interesting and a thought-provoking one because it involves somewhat of an opinion as well as what the rule book states. So what are your thoughts on athletes who used to be on gear competing in a tested federation? And this person messaged me private to let me know that they haven't used gear in over a year and they understand what the rules are, but what are our thoughts on it? Did we think it was ethical or unethical? It's certainly a touchy subject. I'll give you my opinion first, and then I'll give you what the rules are. Because from what I understand of the research, and anecdotal is some of it because you see people who've been on versus off, people who are on, they have the option, of course, of competing in untested federations, which most of us do. But they also usually carry a lot more muscle mass or motor unit recruitment. They put on some things that someone who's a lifelong natural athlete doesn't have that advantage. They may not carry as much muscle mass, so the recovery might be different, and so forth. So there's also the subject of satellite cell proliferation and things like that can add and enhance the athlete that even though they've been off. So to me, I don't think you should compete in a tested federation if you've already crossed that line and have used something. I don't think you belong in a tested federation if you've used something. Now, I know many people will go back and forth because what the rule states, and for USAPL, it actually isn't a lifelong natural drug-free federation. The rule states for them that you have to be off for a minimum of 2 years. If you get caught using something, they give you a 2-year ban, then you can come back and do whatever you want to do. So their rule is 2 years. The USPA, when they started their testing federation, at the time, I believe it was only 1 year. I don't know if it's been updated since then. Somebody can fact check that for me, let me know, but it was a 1 year. So if you wanted to have that gray zone where maybe you came off something and you've used prior, you could compete, test it at that point if you were clean and you were able to succumb to the test and the whole nine. There are some very small federations that are like lifetime drug-free, like the 100% Raw Federation. There's the Nassau Federation. You don't see them around much anymore, but those are supposed to be for the lifetime drug-free athlete and the whole nine. So to me, ethically, it's probably not the coolest thing to do if you've ever been on gear to go back and then do a tested federation, because you do have certain advantages of building long-term that somebody who was never used has. Now, the rule states otherwise you are eligible to. It's your own personal choice. Like we said in the previous question, you're doing this sport because you want to. But I don't think you should turn around and brag about now being in a tested federation or being natty, because you weren't always natty. You weren't always a natural athlete. You have been an enhanced athlete. So it's one of those things where, like, I'm not asking you to self-impose an asterisk, but just understand that maybe your results were achieved at the advantage of where somebody else who's competing in that federation didn't. And I'll also add this. Literally no one gives a shit. No one's ever asked me if I can be tested or untested. It is what it is. Literally no one cares. We get the opposite of this, where we have people who don't use anything and compete in tested federations and are constantly pontificating about how natty they are. No one cares. Compete where you want to, compete where it's accessible to you, enjoy competing. But in my opinion, ethically, you should not do that. That's just my opinion. That's not what the rules state.
Yeah, I mean, even with, you look at the science. Yeah, you look at the science clearly shows that you have an advantage if you take any type of anabolics, like Trevor said, the satellite cell proliferation, the myonucleotide, all that stuff is affected, and it's going to be there for the rest of your life. So, ethically, it's probably not the greatest thing to do. If you're a subpar lifter and you just want to compete locally and like that's the only federation that's around, sure, that it is what it is. If whatever gets you the opportunity to compete, But if there's an opportunity to compete in non-drug tested federations, then that's the route you should go. If you're someone who's just trying to get an upper hand and compete in a drug tested federation now because you've built up some strength, and then all of a sudden it's like, well, I can be more competitive here, so I'm just going to move here. It's like, well, that's just stupid. Like, that's just not fair, you know. And one of the things I can think of that would maybe sway my mind would be, say, if you're a power lifter competing in and taking gear and being on PEDs, and then all of a sudden you switch to a sport like Olympic lifting. Do they have non-drug tested Olympic lifting federations?
No, John North tried to start one once. It didn't go anywhere.
I bet he did.
They showed up to test him because he was so active in like the USAW, and then he like disappeared and took off. I got like a lifetime ban.
He John Jones and hit under the ring all day long. But so, you know, if you're transitioning from like a power lifter to an Olympic lifter and you just want to compete and you're not ultra competitive, then, you know, and that's the only route you can go, then yeah, sure. You know, I'm not going to be like, oh, you should take estrogen for the amount of time you took testosterone, you know, that way you can level the playing field. But these same women who are asking these questions, or men, sorry, I don't want to put anyone out there, women or men who are asking the question. But the way I think of, like, if a woman's asking the question, you know, would she have the same opposition if a man transitioned to a female, competed against her in the same weight class? Would she be like, well, that's cheating, he's a man? Well, it's like, well, guess what you start to become when you put drugs into your body? A man. So it's like, you know, what are you going to be? Where do you draw the line, right, on what's ethical and what's not? So that would be the question.
That was that fine line Tony tried to walk there of not speaking in an absolute statement, calling out all females. It can happen quickly if you're not careful.
Well, I don't think many guys would be like, oh, this female can't come into the men's division because all of a sudden she identifies as a man, and be like super worried about it. I mean, there are a few, don't get me wrong, but I think for most cases, if a man joins a female federation in any capacity, there's a lot of female athletes that will say, well, that's cheating. And then you're like, well, if you look at your testosterone levels, you guys are probably pretty close. So is it really cheating? You know? So it's just, if you're an athlete and none of that ever bothers you, and then I guess, you know, do whatever you want. But that's just the way I look at it.
Sure. I mean, we have right now, Claire's wearing a USA powerlifting t-shirt, so it's USAPL. So, I mean, what would be your opinion on that in that regard?
I think if you have to ask, you already know the answer.
Probably the best response.
You know, I'm coming at this as like an anecdotal thing in terms of like, if I'm competing against someone, yes, would I like the playing field to be level? Of course. But at the same time, like, I also want to compete against the best lifters in the world. So if she won over me because of that one reason, I would be like, I think I'd be a little peeved, definitely. But at the same time, I guess it's like that ideal thing of like, ideally there would be no drug testing, but like ideally, you know, there would be no gender coefficient. You could just lift against, you know, whoever it was in any weight class, and, you know, whoever wins. But I think in that case, you do have to admit that you have an advantage, and you have to admit the intention of why you are switching to a drug tested federation. Like, if it is the intention to be more competitive, that's pretty ethically crappy. But that's the thing, if it's just a local backyard meet, you're raising money for charity, it doesn't matter, nothing's on the line, I think that's when you can kind of maybe justify it. But again, entirely nuanced. It depends on your intention, and it depends on, you know, I don't know, do some soul searching.
Yeah, I mean, you're always going to be judged for it. Someone's always going to judge you for what your decision is, whether your decision is to go back to it or away from it. Mm-hmm. But really, the reality is what is it you want to accomplish? That's what ultimately matters. And as long as it's within the rules, then you're not breaking any rules, then you're doing something that's okay. But Tony and I are both of the opinion that, you know, you do have an advantage of it, scientifically speaking, so you probably shouldn't ethically. But if you choose to and it's within the rules, you're not actually breaking any rules. It's almost like the debate about arching. When you see someone who has a masterful arch, it's like a Swedish that's cheating. He moves at 1 inch. Like, it's within the rules, and he's doing an IPF, so his head's in contact, his feet are flat. He's not manipulating the rules. He's doing the best he can to apply his abilities within the rules. So if it's within the rules, it's within the rules.
I mean, if you're gonna do it, like, completely commit to it, right? Like become androgen dominant, get some PCOS going on, like really fuck up your fertility and hormones. That way, where's your commitment level at? And technically
Yes.
speaking, I did just compete in a drug tested competition, so I'm pretty much natural drug tested athlete myself now.
Yeah. Jiu-jitsu tournament. They are tested competitions. Yeah.
That they are. So Claire is not the only one on this panel who is a drug tested athlete.
I've done some weightlifting meets. I've been tested.
All right. So the next question, let me see if I can find it. Do you remember what it was? Is there anything male coaches can do to make their female clients more comfortable? So I would assume that this is going to be like an in-person thing. If you're making your female clients uncomfortable through email and Skype calls or whatever, that's another whole other issue that you should probably check in with somebody about. But the idea of when you're coaching a female as a male, one-on-one, and maybe they're not doing something, maybe there has to be some type of, palpation that you have to do to get them to use the muscles correctly. It's just about communicating with them and letting them know, like, hey, this is what I see, this is what I can do to fix that. Is that okay with you? And then if they say no and it's uncomfortable, then you don't pursue that anymore. Don't try to find other ways to say it, right? If you act as a professional and you're doing things and they trust you, it shouldn't be that big of a problem. But it is something that is going to come up quite often, especially nowadays, and rightfully so. There's a lot of people that take advantage of that position, and they do become a little bit grabbier, and they do become a little bit, more handsy and stuff. So I think as long as you can fully communicate and explain to them what you're trying to do, what you're trying to accomplish, and then if they say yes, then it's just about trying to be as gentle as possible, right? Like if you're trying to get someone to hip hinge properly, or you're trying to get them to do a posterior pelvic tilt, do you have to have your entire hands on them for contact, or can you just use like your thumb and index finger, like fingertips, to do it, right? Like there's certain levels of issues that can come about, so you just have to be prepared for that. You can ask a female friend of like, hey, what would be comfortable? It's like when you're at a dinner party or with a friend or something, right? Like, oh, hand here on the lower back is okay, a couple more inches down, you're like, what the fuck are you doing, man? I thought we were just friends. Right? So there's lines that you don't want to cross, and and this is obviously me mansplaining how women are going to be okay with it. So let's just get Claire's opinion on this before I put my foot in my mouth.
Probably much better.
That's pretty much exactly what I would say is communication and, weirdly enough, consent. It's one of those things of, you need to know where your client's boundaries are, especially if they're female. And, given some history too, there could be any sort of thing where like loud voices, any sort of contact, or like feeling cornered. There are things within your environment that you can be aware of to make sure that your client is comfortable. And it's always communicate. Even if it seems to be ridiculous, like communicate that. You want to know where your client's boundaries are, and make them feel as comfortable as possible. In terms of like actual coaching too, usually I will use touch like last. Like I will try to cue it, I will try to demonstrate it, I will try to do several things before that, just to kind of avoid any of those situations where like something could be either misconstrued in a different way or make somebody uncomfortable. But again, it's very nuanced. There are some women who are like, give it, like do whatever you want to do, but then there are some people who like might have some trauma in their past and may not handle certain situations really, really well. So just being open, being honest, and also not mansplaining, but like not brushing things off as nothing. If someone comes to you with a very particular like emotion or something like that too, not that you have to address every single one that comes your way, but women, I think especially, want to be heard in any capacity. So it's, if they feel like you are not listening to them, or if you're not being genuine, they're gonna call you on it, and they're gonna either take their business elsewhere, or they're gonna find another another person to talk to. So
Sure. It comes down to consent. And if they have expressed that they are uncomfortable and it's your job to change your verbiage or change your antics or change your tactics, can you guarantee that any reverse male or female is going to be comfortable? No, because everybody is unique and individual. Some people, like you said, will use certain verbiage that they think is fine. And the second you use the same verbiage, all of a sudden becomes they're uncomfortable. So it's a matter of once they've expressed that they don't like this trajectory of conversation or contact, your job to change it, apologize for it, acknowledge it, because they're making you aware of it.
Yeah, I think acknowledging it if you do make a mistake and being sorry about it is something that's huge and can be impactful too, because you're showing empathy and you're showing that you do care. And like Claire said, like that should be the last thing, right? Like becoming a coach, and one of the things you have to do as an online coach is like you have to learn to communicate without actually being able to touch someone. So learning those verbal cues and having like a wide variety of different ways to say the same thing can be very, very helpful. And if you do know, like say you've had a female client express to you she feels uncomfortable because something's happened to her in the past, and you know that that client needs help with stuff, ask maybe one of your male co-workers to come there, and then you can demonstrate on that person, right? And then that way you never have to physically, you have to build trust, you have to earn trust with all your clients, especially ones of the opposite sex. So the more you can do without going over to the touching side of things, the better it's going to be for sure. But it's difficult because hopefully as a trainer and a coach, you are trying to do the right thing, and it becomes sketchier and sketchier because guys just fuck things up a lot, and it just makes it harder for everyone else.
It is the internet.
yeah.
It is for sure. Trevor, you got the next question?
Yeah, Riley included this one. It's a good one. What mistakes did you make when you first started putting out coaching content?
So, Claire, you're new to this, so you might not be fully aware of the several mistakes you've made in your short time. But ask Paul. I'm sure he has a notebook full of notations.
Yeah, all the things Claire has said.
Yeah.
No, it's funny though too. I think Paul, we recently just had a client come back to us too, and he was used to having like a 45-minute warm up, and Paul's like, no, we've updated a little bit. So I'm sure there's always some stuff that we have, even just in old programs and things like that we're like, oh, we've changed our views on that, we've updated a little bit. I think for me, I haven't changed much. I've only been producing content for a few months, so.
Yeah.
I'm sure, in 10 years we'll look back and be like, no, I could have done that better. But for right now, I'm better at like sniffing it out of like, oh, hey, that's like not super great. I don't like the way that's done. I'm going to try to avoid doing that. Like for right now, I'm trying not to make content that's black and white, that's full absolutes, that creates a lot of fear of like, if you do this the wrong way, you're going to just die. Like it's truly trying to.
Yeah. There are people out there who will say that, like Snap City, you're going to die or it's only a matter of time before you break. Right or wrong, I think the biggest mistake coaches make as far as content is not putting it out there at all. They have the imposter syndrome or the perfectionist syndrome. Like I talk about this with Bridgeford all the time because he's so afraid of putting content out there. I'm like, dude, film it once, don't look at it, just freaking post it and let people decide if they want to use it or not. Because you will second guess yourself into paralysis. And I laugh because people talk about how much content I put up. I am literally caffeinated, out of breath, stumbling on my words, sweating from head to toe, and I'm still going to post it. And I still have a rule. It's one take and done. And because I know it's going to help someone. I don't care if it helps one person, if it helps 1,000 people, it's going to help someone. So I put it out there. And usually it's in direction of helping one of the clients who are already coached. So because like Tony said, we're virtual, we're not necessarily there in person, I can give them a little bit more detail, a little bit more in depth of what I'm looking for, and then I just send that to the client. And what happened was instead of filming these things over and over and over again, because issues tend to be common and we see the same issues, I just started posting them for everyone and saving my own videos. And anytime I see an athlete that has the issue, I send it along to them. I'm noticing this, please work on these 2 videos. And it's real simple for me. So it serves 2 purposes. So it helps the community, it spreads awareness, and and it helps me coach athletes because instead of having to constantly go in and redo the same shot over and over and over again, I already have a library of content I can send to them to help them fix their issues or problems. And people are aware of the coaching, so it has multiple benefits. And I think that's what holds so many coaches back from developing their business is you have to be a communicator and a leader. And if you're afraid to put that communication content out there, why should anyone come to you for coaching if you can't even put it out there? You have to be willing to coach everyone and everything, whether it's your intent or not, because you're demonstrating that you can communicate to an athlete of how to help correct their issues or fix them. I shouldn't say fix, I should say enhance or optimize or whatever. But how to at least help them address the issues that they have. And that's a huge part of communication. So if you are afraid to put content out there, you are afraid of communicating with an athlete. And that's the number one thing we do as a coach is communicate with the athlete to facilitate a result. So the biggest mistake most coaches make is they don't put anything out there. They're like, well, I've already seen this done before. Who cares? Your audience hasn't. There's different people. It's going to help someone. I forget more than I remember. So if I see something again, I'm like, oh, yeah, that was great. I forgot that. Like yesterday, I put a post up about my workout, and I had abs of choice. I did figure eights for my abs. That's something I probably haven't done in 4 or 5 years. Just because I was given the choice of a directive, I got creative. So it was something that I had forgotten about, and somebody else commented, I haven't done those in forever. Good idea. Simple as that. It wasn't directed at anyone, but it was content that was helpful to somebody else.
I like how Riley asked a specific question of like, what have you done wrong as a coach? And Trevor's like, well, this is what all coaches do wrong. So technically speaking, Trevor's never done anything that he regrets through social media. So
oh no, I have a million things that I regret and have done wrong. But that was my first real mistake. Was I used to sneak it into captions that, like when I would post like training, I would sneak like a warm up in the caption. Here's what I'm working on, like subtly, like hopefully someone notices. And I'm like, you know what? Screw that. I'm just going to go all in. My mistake was being afraid to actually coach everyone online and being helpful. That was literally my mistake. I've said the wrong things in some of the videos. I've used cues like Tony talked about that some people got turned off with. And I'm like, that's okay. I'm not trying to reach everyone. I'm trying to reach the people who want it.
You sound like
you get turned off.
You sound like Michael Scott in The Office, where they're like, "Oh, what are your biggest weaknesses?" "Oh, my biggest weakness is that I care too much. I work too hard." my biggest content mistake that I've ever made was that I don't put out my greatness all the time. It's like, okay,
no, definitely not. They're definitely subpar standards. Some people complain they can't hear them, and I'm like, that's okay.
It is hard to think about stuff too that you've done wrong because you try to like. It's like trauma that you try to put in the back of your mind where that like a psychologist will pull out later on. Like, oh, in 2010, I saw this social media post. Like, I tried to black that out. Don't bring that back up. For me, a lot of it was not necessarily what I did with strength athletes, but I grew up, and I think Trevor grew up with this as well. Is like conjugate was like super, super big. So one of my biggest mistakes was doing that with a lot of football players and skill players and athletes was the idea of max effort training and training them more like a power lifter, because I learned a lot from Joe DeFranco in the very beginning. And, that was some of the stuff where it's like, thank God these guys were resilient high school kids, because if they were like, real adults, they would probably have gotten fucked up. And then also the idea of, persevering through a lift, even if it's not there throughout the day, right? So there's been a lot of times in conjugate training, like on a max effort day, where I'd miss a lift and I'd be like, I'm going to do it again. I'm going to do it again until I get it. And it's like, that's the worst rationale ever. But there was one time I was doing a reverse band deadlift, and I wanted to do a reverse band deadlift with 700 pounds. And I fucking tried that thing like at least 12 times. And yeah. And you would think like, oh, it's not going anywhere. And I would always try to convince myself like, oh, do this differently. So that would be something that, thankfully back in the day, like there was only like barely any place to post content. So I was only fucking up myself at the time and some of the high school kids that I was working with. But I also had the knowledge of like training them athletically too. I just wouldn't have done so much of the heavy lifting. I wouldn't have done so much of the things that are like full range of motion that they may not need under heavy loads. And then as myself, understanding auto regulation, and not every training session has to be balls to the wall, the hardest thing in the world, is something that I didn't really grasp until really later on, once I found other ways to train outside of conjugate. So those are probably the two biggest mistakes that I've made looking back on it. That's about, yeah.
I think you touched on Paul having a client come back that you changed protocol to what he used to do versus what he does now. And everybody's going to have that. They're going to have the belief system they used to have that's been changed because they were aware or educated further, and new research has come out. And I think that's also, yes.
And
I
it
think
should.
that's also a mistake that we will all make. We will have a client, like Tony said, with the high school kids or something where we brought them down a path that we thought was right for them at the time that later realized, you know what, that probably wasn't the best direction. So we're all going to make those mistakes. And I think I talked about the biggest mistake as far as she mentioned new coaches that are online. That it was referring to that. But I think the biggest mistake that a lot of us make is not recognizing those mistakes and saying, how can I improve upon that? You have to be willing to admit the mistake first to yourself and then improve upon that. We're all going to make mistakes. Those lessons are going to be permanent lessons that I don't want to repeat that mistake again.
Yeah.
And so sometimes it's the verbiage, sometimes it's the program we run or the exercise selection we chose, or maybe it's the cue we used, or we all were in that nocebo effect from the functional training of the 90s and early 2000s of if you don't lift in neutral, you're going to hurt yourself.
Not everyone's as old as you, big guy. You said 90s and 2000s.
They will be eventually. You're going to catch up. All of you, all you kids are going to catch up. But you said when we were coming up, the only information on powerlifting was conjugate programming. People didn't really talk about linear daily undulating periodization or wave loading. It was they all covered the same topic because that's what was cool. And the internet didn't really exist in the same capacity. So you're going to make mistakes, but the bigger mistake is not capitalizing on that lesson you learned from that and continuing to further your education. So don't be afraid to make a mistake because that's a valuable lesson. It's a sport with risks. You're under maximal loads, you might hurt yourself. That's just a risk that the athlete chose to take. If you are not egregious with the amount of volume or work and the capacity you have them training at, you're not contributing to that issue. And I think that's what Paul's argument is. It's not so much the form that's contributing to the injury as much as it is the amount of work they're doing or the loads they're choosing to do it under that over time breaks an athlete down as opposed to the form they're lifting with. Mm-hmm. And we've all seen someone who has horrendously bad posture or form and they've never gotten hurt. Like, how does that happen when they lift like that? It's because they don't do so much that they're over fatigued and tired. They just don't have great technique. They just have a better system of management as far as their stresses is concerned, ideally, or they're just 12.
No, that's actually how we've been kind of managing our narrative too, in terms of whenever we coach anyone, we try to coach the whole person too. So it's, all right, we've got our programming, we've got your programming for your goals, but also how are you sleeping? Are you eating? Are you hydrated? And how's your stress level? How's everything going on? So we kind of try to coach that full client autonomy of they have so many things that they can do to get better in any particular way. And, I think our content recently has been very geared towards trying to just make them just client self-efficacy of, hey, you have control over the things in your life. Let's try to, do these few things. And then, it's one of those things, especially within the injury realm, you could stub your toe tomorrow. You can also fall down the stairs. There are so many other things that it's not just within the gym realm where something kind of spontaneous can happen. It's just, that's part of life, I think, in some capacity. So.
Yeah. There's an air of unpredictability that you have to deal with.
Right. Yeah. Exactly.
Definitely. All right. Next question. Exercises to strengthen your lower back. So this is something that we get a lot because people, you lower back load in powerlifting a lot, right? And it's well, my lower back is my biggest weakness. How can I make it stronger? And it's okay, well, what muscles are in your lower back? And it's well, you have a bunch of fascia back there, and you have these smaller muscles that are stabilizers. But what's the big thing that actually makes your lower back strong? It's oh, well, it's your glutes and your lats. So the idea of strengthening your lower back with specific lower back movements is something that gets done a lot, but it's not something that's necessarily going to actually strengthen your lower back. So it's understanding the mechanics of what stabilizes your pelvis through your lower back region, and then how can you strengthen those things up in conjunction. So I always think of it in terms of if I can get the glute stronger and then I can get the lat stronger and then they can stabilize under load, that's going to make the lower back safer and quote unquote stronger. But that's just my initial thought whenever I hear something like that. But there are definitely exercises that can strengthen those things posteriorly all together or individually. And I don't know if you guys have a preference when thinking about trying to strengthen, an entire body part like that has a lot of moving parts. Do you do that together or do you try to break it down individually? And in my mind, it's well, together is going to probably lend itself to having the best efficacy moving forward and developing in that muscle. But if that person also has a hard time of connecting down to their lower lat, maybe isolating that lower lat to create some type of stability and strength within that area may be a better option. So it really depends on what the client has from a cue. Like if you have a deadlift and if you have a client deadlifting and they don't ever feel their lats engaged, it may not be advantageous for you to have them doing, barbell back extensions or other type of hip hinge movements to strengthen up that pattern because they can't feel their lats to begin with. Maybe it'll be better to isolate their lats until they get that connection. And then once they finally get that connection, then you can strengthen things in unison. But what do you guys think about that?
I think you touched on it. Identifying is, do they need to build a motor pattern or recruitment, a mind muscle connection to the muscles involved? Like maybe they don't know how to feel their glutes, maybe they don't know how to feel their lats. In that case, isolation work up front is probably your best option so they can create that connection to it.
Do you feel like, before you go on, do you feel like people can just strengthen that lower back, right? Like, because it's mostly just fascia for the most part.
It's fascia and erectors, and when people misunderstand strengthening their lower back, they instantly think of hyperextensions or really heavy RDLs.
Yeah.
And ideally, and I'm going to say ideally, so it's not applied for everyone in the situation here, so we touch on that. We want that trunk to be kind of rigid and stable to support load. It shouldn't necessarily be the prime mover. That was the intent behind Squat University's post, that it shouldn't be the prime mover. He just worded it somewhat poorly and blanketly. It should be a prime stabilizer. So we should train it as a stabilizer, and that's when you're going to get into things like loaded carries or bear hugs or heavy holds with marches, or like front squats is something that people do. In the weightlifting world, you would see a lot of like the overhead squat mechanics and stuff like that, because it was teaching you to stabilize through a lot of dynamic movements and segments, because that was the goal, was to stabilize the trunk. So something as simple as taking a heavy front rack barbell and then trying to walk it, or like a Zercher carry, these things are forcing you to stabilize that trunk in unison. If you take a front rack barbell, you may not have the mobility for that, but you're going to feel a lot of anterior chain activation. You're going to feel your glutes activate. Now, if you bring your hands down so they're by your sides with like a Zercher hold or a Zercher pickup, you're going to feel your lats engage as well with those glutes, with those hamstrings. So I like Tony's philosophy of, if it's a motor issue, then make sure they know how to isolate and feel that muscle, and then work to integrate that into a pattern. So something like a bear hug hold, where you picked up a 200-pound sandbag, you hold it to your chest as long as you can, your lats are engaged, your glutes are engaged, your abs are engaged, and then maybe working on moving with that. So if you were to then bear hug hold into a bear hug walk or bear hug carry of some kind, you're teaching that prime stabilizer to hold under load for longer periods of time while the appendages are moving, because that's really what's important. That's what we're using those muscles for. We're not strengthening our lower back to be a prime mover, because that should not be the case. We're strengthening to be a prime stabilizer. So when someone needs low back strength, they don't need it as a mover, they need it as a stabilizer. I know I'm repeating myself, but that's really important to understand.
You gotta do it one more time, so you get 3 in.
I thought that was my 3. Was that only 2? I thought it was 3. Okay, she's on me. It's 3. It takes 3 to get people to pay attention. If I did a shit ton of low back extensions, I'm working on the erector endurance, but I'm not working on the position. And a lot of our movement strength is positional. Same as weightlifting, same as strongman. We have to be positionally strong. So I need to have that trunk stable in the bottom end of a squat, or stable as I pick that bar up off the floor for a deadlift. I don't need to be able to do 100 low back extensions, because that's not the same. It's great if I wanted to condition my lumbar spine for endurance. Maybe I'm an ultra runner or an endurance athlete who tends to fall forward as I get fatigued. Maybe for them, that's great. For a strength athlete, how do I strengthen it within that position I'm going to use it as usually my first priority. And like Tony said, I'll go to isolation first to make sure they know what they're supposed to feel, and then progress from there.
That sounds good to me. I think my other only questions that I would ask are like initially when they say they want more low back strength, why and when? So like if there's anything where like within a movement pattern they feel like that's the thing that they need to work on, or if I want to know the why, though, too, in terms of, is it something that they've noticed? Is it something that someone else told them? Like, I want to know what that narrative is, just to make sure that, like, we're kind of both on the same page in terms of why we're working that particular area of our body as well. If that makes any sense?
Yeah, absolutely. Because you'll have people that say, oh, my lower back's it feels fatigued and stiff all the time. And that may be more of an indicator of, like, well, because you're in anterior pelvic tilt, you're all day long, so you're just fatiguing it, right? So then it's like, we'll spend more time posteriorly pelvic tilted. But if it's like, I just feel like my lower back collapses every time I'm under load, then that may be, yeah. So definitely that's a really good question to ask for sure, because you have to figure out, the causes behind why they want something fixed. So definitely a good way to look at it.
That and we have a monkey see monkey do culture where someone will see someone doing exercise on the gram and be like, well, maybe I need that too. It's like, that's not your issue, that's
Yeah.
their issue.
Maybe we can start like a Jaffe Colt tradition of like bear hugging your training partner for time. Because not only are you going to strengthen your lower back, but you're also going to get oxytocin release. So it's just going to be like, it's like that motherly love that you're going to get as well. So I think it's good, but you have to do it skin on skin. So you have to do it shirtless, of course. So get consent first, and then bear hug each other for time.
She does koala me. Like when I come home and I've been gone for like a day, she will jump up into my arms and koala hug me. And it's funny because the first thing that fatigues me when I'm holding her there for like a minute is like my hamstrings. So it's the limiting factor in my strength is my hamstrings. My glutes are good, my lats are great. It's like, okay, these hamstrings really need some work.
Which is why you have a hard time holding your lockout on a deadlift.
That's correct. That and because every time I get to a heavy weight, I keep going right to a freaking dynamic start again. I'm like, God damn it, static start, static start.
I feel that too. It's real. That's funny.
I could take every single rep static start, all of prep, all of training. The second it's like 800 pounds in the bar dynamic. I'm like,
well, yeah, you're trying to fix 10 years of a bad habit,
Yeah.
That's funny.
And that's one of the hardest things to convey to lifters when they're learning new technique is like once you get to that heavy single or heavy double, your old technique is going to be super prevalent almost every single time, so it's just going to they get frustrated like, oh, my warm-ups feel great and I can do the technique perfect. Like, well, let's fucking hope so. It's your warm-ups, once you get to your working weight, I try to tell lifters like, don't overthink top sets because that's when you'll get fucked up. It's like just pick one cue. That's the one thing you want to work on, and then just lift. And over time, if you do your warm-ups properly and everything's working in conjunction, that new pattern will get ingrained. But it takes years to ingrain a new pattern,
I've been
if ever.
Static starts now for a year and a half.
Right.
And every time I've gotten to a top-end weight still, I've gone dynamic.
Yeah, for sure.
It's very validating though too. I start every time I try to do something new with a cue, I'm like, oh man, why is it still not working? And I'm like, oh, I've only been doing this for like 3 months. Okay, cool.
Yeah.
That's all. Gotta remember that.
It's gonna be a long game, yeah.
Definitely. Yeah. And it's like, I think I'm playing the long game. And then like a year goes by and you're like, oh, that wasn't the long game. Like 5 years. 10 years? Okay.
10 years is the long game for sure.
And I was just with Greg, and he talked about that. He's like, if you can't do something 1,000 times for 5 years straight, it's never going to happen. And that's just the way it is. Repetition.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, that 10,000 hour rule is there for a reason, right? And that's just the way to get really good at something. It's also the way to get really bad at something. Then you have to fix that. It's like, fuck, man. So that's why it's important to be very critical of how you're doing things in the beginning so you don't make those mistakes. And, when we started lifting, it was like, especially if you're doing conjugates, like just fucking 1 rep max, whatever it takes, Pete Rubish squat, and now it's like, fuck, I wish I would have never done that. Cause now doing strongman, you learn to hitch, and it's like my deadlift, I fucking hitched it for 10 years. Like I have the worst lockout because I've had that pattern ingrained in me. So then my glutes never really got built up the way they should be. So it's always been a weakness that I just could never fix.
Yep. Fall to the default pattern. We got time for one more? Are we good?
Yeah, no, go for it.
We got Dalton's, and I always appreciate Dalton because he sends us questions pretty much every week. Why would you use stability movements like chaos squats or bench or similar movements? So when would you factor in a chaos work or something that is like traveling or fighting against stability through the range of motion?
When you want to get more likes on Instagram?
It's a lot more fun, and they are great, challenging, absolutely.
I think as you progress through an injury, that's not a bad place to put some type of stability work, as long as it's like bilateral stability work and you're progressing through some type of an injury. Like for you with your adductor tear, once you're able to put some type of load on the bar and you wanted to challenge yourself in a way that is going to elicit a stimulus and an adaptation, but you didn't want to add more load, doing it in a chaos manner can help build some more stability within that region of the thing that you're trying to work. I'm personally not a huge fan of creating exercises that require more stability. Like I don't like the fucking plank rows, whatever that thing is, where people are on a bench and they have, their one leg, it's like a bird dog row. I'm not a fan of that. I'm not a fan of anything that's not going to allow you to elicit the most amount of output that you can, because I think load under under load is when you're going to create the most stability. And if you can't create stability on both legs and you need to add some type of chaos theory to do it, I think that that's a misguided way of doing things, right? If you have issues with stability on both legs, well then just take it down to one leg, right? If you can't stand on one leg, then why would you add anything else in there? Then if you can stand on one leg, then you add dynamically different things to strengthen that position up, like single leg RDLs, weighted hip airplanes, offset marches, things like that. I think would be a better choice. I know you incorporate them and you'll have a great reason for it. Me personally, that's why I don't do it. And that's just the way that I was learned how to create better stability within a movement pattern. Because it is not my forte. So I'm very much biased to people that have taught me that. And Jordan Shallow is someone that I've taken his course and I've learned from. So my bias is going to be more towards the way he teaches things. So you'll have a better answer for sure, Trevor.
Yeah. Well, I look at it from two aspects. One, you're speaking on load. That is your actual capacity and strength capacity as far as load is concerned. And then the other one is, what are you trying to accomplish with the stability work? Are you doing stability work for the sake of the Instagram because it's stability work? Or do you have an issue like Tony talked about where somebody maybe can't co-contract their glutes with their lats at the same time? So for someone like that, a bird dog row is great. But what is the limiting factor in a bird dog row is stability. You're not going to be using the same load. So, and somebody had just asked me about that. I think Fernando, who may have asked you the question about the females, asked me about that in one of my posts. I have 2 different row sessions each week. The first one is a barbell row. That's my load on my capacity. There really isn't a reason for me to repeat it again the second time of the week because I'm not trying to be the heaviest bent row champion of the world. I can use my secondary row, which is a one-arm row, to add a lot of variation. I'm in a hypertrophy phase, so it's time under tension, and maybe I can incorporate more trunk stability work into that row. So I did a different row today. Every week I've done a different row pattern just to kind of show people variety's sake. So my earlier week stuff is my heavy bent rows. My secondary row work is something different. It's a one-arm row. It's some type of variation. It was specified to be somewhere between like an RPE 6.5 or 7.5 for most of the weeks. It really wasn't heavy, where my bent row was listed as something heavier. So I looked at it as, okay, what can I gain from this as a personal challenge? There are variations of plank rows I do like. Planking on a bench and rowing isn't one of them. That's kind of dumb. But I do like to use something like a side plank row because they're incorporating that isometric hold of their trunk muscles, their lower back muscles, with the glutes, the lateral glute, trunk muscles, and also rowing the lats on the contralateral side, which is a great way to teach someone stability if they do like a mixed grip deadlift where they tend to helicopter their squats. They're getting some positional awareness. So it's always a gray area, and the answer is always it depends, which everybody hates. But for some people who maximal strength is the main goal, they're very weak or not very strong, I'm going to give them the bilateral movement. They just need to get bigger and they need to get stronger. For somebody who has some nuances where I might see where they're breaking apart in the torso and falling apart, their first row of the week might be their heavy row. Let's say it's seal row or bent over row. And if I have them do a secondary row later in the week, it's going to be some type of stabilizing row so they can integrate 2 things, because I'm going to get the best from working both ends of the spectrum and not isolating only one, because we tend to get overuse injuries if we isolate only one end of the spectrum. So I look at it as a total picture. I don't want to throw it in just for shits and giggles. There's no point in throwing an exercise for shits and giggles. So sometimes when you see someone doing like a chaos squat or a really, really heavy band bell bench press with like 4 kettlebells hanging from each side, there's no point in doing a 3-rep max with a heavy band bell bench press with 3 kettlebells hanging from the side. Just use real load, because you're never going to have to fight to stabilize the weight that hard when it's your maximal load. You're going to get tight everywhere. But if you have an injury, let's say you're coming back from a sprain of your rotator cuff, by putting 1 kettlebell on that band bell and doing sets of 20 or 30 with some control, you're going to restart building that endurance of that stabilizer muscle group, which is the primary function of chaos in the first place, or something like a chaos push-up. It's what is your intent and what is your application? Doing it for shits and giggles is a waste of time. Doing it for entertainment, sometimes you have to. You may have a client who gets bored, you throw a random thing in like that and they get happy because they're doing it. So it's just to keep a client happy. But ideally, we're going to use the bilateral movements for loading and stimulus as far as strength, and we might use some of the unilateral stuff for trunk stability or overall ability by creating, your trunk stability is your appendix's ability. I'm stumbling on my words there a little bit. But the more we can stabilize the trunk with movement of the arms, the better we get at those big movements, because we learn how to do it together. It wouldn't ever be my primary movement. That's what Tony's talking about. I wouldn't lead the way with the bird dog row and always have the bird dog row, because you're going to limit how much load the athlete can use by how much stability they have. But I would use it for variations where I need someone to work on their trunk.
No, that makes sense. I think my only other is I feel like for the clients that I work with, where a time constraint or there's like other higher priorities, I think I would be hesitant to program them for them, especially with
Yeah.
like if if there's a complex setup or something like that too. I think I would take those factors into consideration first before adding it in, unless I knew there would be like a pretty, unless there is like that injury aspect to it too as well.
100%. If somebody has a time constraint, you're going to see a lot of 2 sets max reps. You're not going to see a percentage. You're not going to see a rep range. You're going to be like pull-ups, 2 sets, max reps, dips, 2 sets, max reps, go home. That's what it's going to be for your accessories because that's the time you're giving me.
Right.
Yeah, so that makes it even more of a, idea of like what's the best bang for your buck, right? If you're having people do these
Yep.
warm-ups that don't necessarily that you can somehow elicit those warm-ups within their actual program. And that's what people don't understand too. It's like, right, like, oh, today's lower body day, I have to do my McGill Big Three to warm up for. And it's like, well, if you incorporate exercises within your program that strengthen those same things, that's your warm up for your next day anyways, right? Unless you're just completely sedentary sitting on the couch all day. But people don't understand, I can do a single arm suitcase carry and that's going to be the same thing as a bird dog, right?
Yep.
And that's going to allow me to strengthen those movements so that I don't have to fucking do a bird dog ever again, right? If if you can squat more than the bar, a bird dog is a very remedial thing. You have to eventually learn how to progress. And if people are on a time crunch, learning to add those progressions into their training program seamlessly is a way for them to not have to do them. And it just, makes sense, right? Like, that's why I incorporate certain types of curls into the program. It's like, do you need bigger biceps? No, but if you fucking do curls, the likelihood of you having some type of glenohumeral shoulder impingement is going to be a lot less. The fact that you're going to have bicep tendonitis is going to be a lot less. So that's why we do it in there. It's like chopping up the vegetables and fucking putting it in the kids', dinner so they don't know it's there. So they fucking eat it anyways, right? That's what I have to do with Trevor. Every time I go out to dinner with Trevor, I gotta fucking cut up his vegetables and hide it in his food so he fucking eats them.
There are no vegetables going on my plate.
But yeah, I think just that learning to be able to incorporate those things in a more meaningful way, like Trevor said, don't just do stuff for the sake of doing stuff in variety, which as a coach, that's a hard thing to do, right? It's like, Trevor, you even said it yourself, like on those lighter days, I'm doing variety just to showcase variety for other people so they have an idea of what they can incorporate into their program. As a coach, it's like, you got to be very careful with that because then maybe people think like, oh, I'm just going to continuously switch shit up all the time. And it's like, well, there's nuances to everything, and not saying that you're doing it.
System.
Not saying, yeah, conjugate accessory work, keep the body guessing.
Conjugate accessory work. Something different every day. And, it's one day a week or twice a week on accessories that are just bodyweight stuff or light loads that I will do that for the sake of variety. And then also I use it as an identifier. What am I falling short on with this movement? What do I feel like I need to incorporate more of? What am I, body awareness, positional awareness, and stuff like that. And I think Tony brought up a fantastic point that a lot of these can be included as the warm-ups for the day because you're going to be targeting those muscle groups. So if you're on the floor doing bird dogs every day, it's a very remedial movement. It gets to a point where the intent is to contract the contralateral oblique, which is the opposite side oblique. So let's say he did a suitcase carry with a lot of arm swing with the free arm. So if I held the kettlebell on my left arm, my right oblique is going to contract as I walk, and I do a lot of contralateral hard arm swing with the right arm. I'm getting the same effect as a bird dog, but instead of just being on the floor with my body weight, now I'm carrying a 50, 60, 70, 80 pound dumbbell or kettlebell. I'm loading it much more. I'm strengthening that position, and I'm achieving the goal, which is the warm up, which is to get my body temperature up and to activate core musculature that's going to stabilize into the bar. And that's where people go wrong is if they just see a bird dog, they will stay doing a bird dog for 2 sets of 20 for the rest of their life. They never progress the movements.
Yeah.
For sure. All right, that's all the questions we have, guys. Thank you so much. Thank you, Claire, for coming on. If people want to follow you and your awesome infographics because you're a graphic designer by trade, where can they do that at?
You guys can follow me on Instagram at Claire_resilient. So.
And if they want coaching from you, is that the same place that they can reach out and get coaching, or do you guys have a website as well?
That's the same. You guys can also check out at Resilient Training Lab or resilienttraininglab.com.
Perfect. All right. So make sure you guys check out the companies that support us: Subject Zero Supplements, Iron Rebel, Metrolife, Ritual Apparel.
Yeah.
Isn't there one more?
RP.
RP. Yeah. RP. Yes. Those guys. Yes. Okay. So support them if you want to. We are not a dictatorship. You have freedom to support whoever you want. But I would recommend supporting the first company that I promoted on the show.
I got my shipment today of Subject Zero subs. Feeling
Nice.
pretty good about that.
Yes. And for those of you guys who are going to be curious, if you look on the website, Equilibrium is out of stock. That is because we switched manufacturers. We want the best supplements for you guys, and the manufacturer we were going through got a letter from the FDA that they weren't performing things up to their standards. And as soon as we heard the wind of that, we switched companies. Switching companies makes it a lot harder to get things rolling at first, but we want to make sure that we bring the best products available to you guys and making sure that there's never going to be any incidents with what's in the ingredients. Even though the FDA wasn't for that, it was some silly little thing that they weren't doing correctly. But anything that's off kill for what we want to do, we switch and try to find better companies to do it. So just be patient with that. We do have a new flavor of Restoration coming out, and then we have 3 new products in the works that'll be coming out hopefully in the next 3 to 6 months, and that's kind of like the time frame you have to give with these things because you just never know. But
they're pretty exciting products. I know what's in them. I saw the formulations. They're super exciting. I'm very excited for this.
Yeah, formulations are really good. The products themselves, I don't mind sharing. They're going to be and maybe I should ask Riley if I can share this or not, but I think it'll be fine. It's going to be a cortisol hormone supplement, a joint supplement, and a GDA, and that's going to go along with like the health to performance side of things, and then the next 3 supplements will be back to the performance side of things. And we've got a lot of people that want some type of amino acid or protein, so we'll probably put together some really cool amino acid formula. Protein's still something that I don't really know if we want to venture into quite yet, mainly because there's so many proteins out there that will and I'm getting off on a complete side tangent here, but there's so many proteins that fuck people's stomachs up that it's hard for me to be able to conceptualize coming up with one that'll actually be good for people that won't fuck up their stomach and taste good. So that's why we haven't done that. That's why we haven't ventured into that area. And for those of you who want caffeine in your pre-workout, there's these things called caffeine tabs. They're like $7.
I put that in the video. It's even less. I got like 300 tabs for
Right.
like $6.50 on Amazon.
So cheap. Just get one of those tabs and just fucking add it in there. Like, you don't need caffeine in the product. And that's why we want to give you options to add stuff in, So that's that. Appreciate you guys. Thanks for the questions. Thanks for listening. If you like the show, please go to iTunes and leave a review. Who am I kidding? No one's really listening anymore. But and a 5-star rating, that would be great. Appreciate you guys as always, and tune in next week for the next show.